In this video, we addressed Revelation chapter 2 and 3 and the letters to the seven churches. I should let you know from the get-go that our lecture pause will incorporate some work with the text itself. So I have included sort of a selection of the seven letters to the seven different churches in Revelation that you can print out and use as you go through this lecture. We'll be marking the text, dealing with the world of the text itself, and practicing sort of literarily engaging the text. So I very much encourage you to actually print out what I have uploaded on Moodle. I've given you some wide margins and some spacing for all seven of the letters, and we're going to together mark, you're going to mark one of the letters, and I'm going to show you the way that I have marked that same letter. So if you have not, I encourage you to go ahead and print that out and have it handy with you for the lecture pause. And also if you have markers or colored pencils, to grab those as well, because we're going to be using 7 different colors. Or if you don't have any colored markers or colored pencils, you can sort of just find a way to mark the text differently. But if you have them, go ahead and pause here, grab them, and come on back. So what we're going to do is first talk about letters generally. This slide may look familiar to you from the Introduction to the New Testament class. This is the slide that I use when I introduce letter writing with respect to Paul's letters. And what we're going to see in this video is that Paul's letters sort of more closely follow conventions of ancient letters than do Revelation's letters. And I think there's a good reason for that. By way of reminder, when we're talking about any genre, whether it be an apocalypse, whether it be letters, whether it be some kind of narrative like a biography, those genres are going to have both fixed and fluid elements to them. That is to say that there are going to be things within any given text in a genre that give it away as part of that genre, but at the same time, every individual text is going to sort of show some fluidity with respect to those different genre features, so that not every single text is exactly the same. When it comes to letters, we have things like a salutation, the name of the author coming first, the name of the recipient coming second, and then a greeting usually immediately appended to the name of the author, the name of the recipient. In ancient letters, we normally have some kind of thanksgiving. There are, of course, exceptions to this. And then the body of the letter, where the main content is being relayed. And then finally, a conclusion with a couple of different elements here. So if you remember back to the Greek 1 class, we looked at examples of personal papyri letters. And this one was from Aurelius Dias to his father, Horion, and we sort of marked different features of different papyri texts and then moved that over to Philemon. So we saw here the salutation, the forms of names and the greetings. We have a fairly short thanksgiving here, but Dias saying that he makes supplication to the local gods for his father Horion, and then the body is very short, only sort of one sentence, updating his dad about his studies, and then all of these greetings to different people in the conclusion of the letter. And we also have sort of on the outside of this letter delivery instructions where it's supposed to be sent to. And so when we turn over to something like Philemon, Paul's letter that most closely follows ancient letter writing conventions, we see that Paul generally follows this convention. But when we move over to to Revelation and the letter to Ephesus, we don't find these same conventions sort of embedded in these 7 different letters that are written to the different churches. Some of them are kind of sort of there, but Revelation is doing something different with the letters. It's clear that they are sort of addressed as letters that are addressed to specific churches, but they're not recognizable as to the conventions of ancient letters for the most part. So they're recognizable as letters, but they don't contain sort of the standard generic conventions of a letter. And so the reason for this, I think, is because they are not actually specific letters that were sent only to each specific church. That is to say, the author of Revelation, John, may in fact be addressing things specific to the churches at Ephesus or the churches at Smyrna. But each one of these letters is not intended only for that specific locality. That is to say, the letter to Ephesus is meant to be read and heard by churches in the other cities, as well as probably other places in Asia Minor, not just these 7 different cities. But so what we find in the letters to Revelation is that we actually have different elements, different sort of, we might call generic features to them. And these are consistent throughout these 7 letters in Revelation. And coincidentally or not, there are 7 features of these letters. First is an address, so to whom the letter is addressed. Then there is an element of Jesus's description, how Jesus is sort of visualized, and this harkens back to Revelation chapter 1. There is, in most cases, praise or commendation for the church, something they're doing well. And there is, in most cases, a condemnation, something, a statement of something that specific church is not doing well. There are exhortations and warnings. This is how you should act. If you don't, this is what is going to happen. There is a promise to those who are faithful, whether that be the congregation as the whole or individuals within that congregation. And then at the end, there is a command to listen. And so I want to show you sort of how this works out in the first letter in Revelation, the letter to Ephesus. So I have designated a different color for each one of these generic elements. And what I'm going to ask you to do for this week, one of the things I'm going to ask you to do for this week is go through the 7 different letters and mark either in the same color or with the same marking system these different features. And it might seem a little bit elementary to go and color a text, but it's amazing when you sort of slow down. And one of the things I would always encourage you in your exegesis to do, one of the things that's hardest to do in exegesis is to slow down and sit with the text for a while. Just the act of underlining the text or marking it in different colors, you start to see things that you wouldn't see by doing that marking and by slowing down. So I've given us a different color for all of these different features here, and I'm going to show you here sort of where the lines of these different features fall in the letter to Ephesus. So our address is to the angel of the church in Ephesus, right? So this is going to be sort of almost repeated exactly with the name of the city just changed in each one. And then we have a different element of the description of Jesus in each one of these letters. And again, these descriptions all harken back to how Jesus was described in Revelation chapter 1. Not necessarily sort of in the order they were described in Revelation chapter 1, but they're all features carried over from earlier in the text. And so in the letter to Ephesus, John writes, "These are the words of him who holds the 7 stars in his right hands, who walks among the 7 golden lampstands." And then he moves into the praise and commendation, which in this letter is separated by these 2 elements that we'll come back to in just a moment. So we have sort of two bits of praise or commendation in the letter to Ephesus. The first is, "I know your works, your toil, and your patient endurance. I know that you cannot tolerate evildoers. You have tested those who claim to be apostles but are not, and have found them to be false. I also know that you are enduring patiently and bearing up for the sake of my name, and that you have not grown weary." And then again, another praise, "Yet this is to your credit. You hate the works of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate." So following our first praise, we have the brief condemnation, "But I have this against you, that you have abandoned the love you had at first." And then also the praise is also separated by this exhortation and warning. The exhortation is to remember then from what you have fallen. "Repent and do the works as you did at first. If not," and here comes the warning, "I will come to you and remove your lampstand from its place unless you repent." And we have that move into praise again, and then our command to listen. "Let anyone who has an ear to listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches." followed by the promise to the faithful. And this promise to the faithful comes in different terms. Oftentimes it's this, you see this conquering language. So to everyone who conquers, I will give permission to eat from the tree of life that is in the paradise of God. So we have all of these 7 different features showing up in Ephesus, and we're going to see these repeated with some minor exceptions in all of these 7 letters that are in Revelation. So what I want you to do now is try your hand at this. This is our lecture pause for this video. Go ahead and pause the lecture here. So you have up on your screen the different colors you might use. You can choose to do this differently than I have, of course, but I give this to you so that you might follow the example that I put up here. Go ahead and pause, and if you've printed out that document that gives you some space to work with the text, go ahead and mark it there. If not, you might just sort of draw the lines on your screen from the different features to what you see on the screen here. All right, now that you're back, let me show you what I've come up with, and we'll see if our markings match up with one another. So with respect to Smyrna, our address is to the angel of the church in Smyrna. Our description of Jesus is, these are the words of the first and the last, who is dead and who came to life. Our praise is, I know your affliction and your poverty, even though you are rich. I know the slander on the part of those who say that they are Jews and are not, but are a synagogue of Satan. And we don't have condemnation in this one. So this is one of the unique things about the letter to Smyrna. There are 2 letters in which we don't find condemnation, and the letter to Smyrna is one of them. But then we do have the exhortation and warning. Do not fear. That's the exhortation, what you are about to suffer. Beware, the devil is about to throw some of you into prison so that you may be tested for 10 days. You will have affliction. Be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life. So actually in this one, we also don't have a warning, which might be part and parcel with the fact that we don't have a condemnation. We really just have this exhortation to act in certain ways. And then we have that standard command to listen. Let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. And then the promise is, whoever conquers will not be harmed by the second death. So after this video is over, or sometime later on, you're going to mark the rest of the letters and see what happens as you mark each one of them. So what you'll probably find is that you come up with literary observations about particular letters that are of interest to you, but you'll also see sort of patterns and discrepancies. And those patterns and discrepancies are very much I should note, are very much part of engaging the world of the text. So by doing this, you're very much engaging that particular hermeneutical world, the world of the text. But as you do it, sort of these observations start to come out. And then the process of exegesis is sort of making those observations and then combining them with other features of the text, whether it be the world behind the text, the world in front of the text, or other features of the world of the text as a whole, whether it be words or themes that are used elsewhere in Revelation, and sort of bringing those together to make meaning out of your observations. So by doing this sort of marking of the text, you're in a way gathering that raw data from which you might make observations and interpretations about a particular text. And so there's a sort of movement from the world of the text here. If we start by marking the world of the text, then we can move to those other worlds, moving to the world behind the text. And what you'll find in your commentaries on these chapters of Revelation chapter 2 and 3, oftentimes they give a lot of sort of background information about each particular city that is mentioned in Revelation. And this is all very much engaging the world behind the text. And you'll see some commentators sort of draw direct lines from what they find in the text of these letters itself to those specific cities. And other commentators will do that a little bit less. So I want to sort of give you an example of some of the kinds of information that you might find about Ephesus. So we're not going to go through all 7 cities and sort of me talk to you and give you information. That is what reference tools like this big old commentary from Craig Kester are for. So I'm not going to give you the information in that format, but I just want to sort of give you an example of the kinds of things you might find when you turn to a commentary to get information about the world behind the text and these cities in particular. And then we'll see if we can draw those connections between the world of the text and the world behind the text. When we're talking about Ephesus, we're talking about probably the largest city in Asia Minor, and also a very important travel route and a port city. So if we look at our map of Asia Minor here, if I can move my cursor and you can see it, we have Ephesus right here. Now is actually about 7 miles inland, but in the first century was not 7 miles inland. That the body of water came, the Aegean Sea came right up to Ephesus, so that it was a port city, and it was also sort of a crossroads. So it was an important travel city and an important commercial city, and it was also a really important administrative city. So large, busy city, a whole lot going on there. And there's a whole lot going on, not only sort of with respect to commerce, but also a whole lot going on with respect to polytheistic religion there. So Ephesus was probably best known for one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the so-called Temple of Artemis. So right up here, we have a real live reconstruction of the Temple of Artemis. So not a digital reconstruction. This is a real reconstruction of what the Temple of Artemis is thought to have looked like. And so this is going to be, Artemis is sort of the patron goddess of the city. We get that tale in Acts about the sort of Artemis guilds being upset with Paul for coming in and sort of upsetting city life with the Christian message. So we have sort of an important pagan center of worship here with respect to Artemis, but we also have, and particularly probably important for Revelation, we have the remains of an imperial temple that were dedicated to Domitian and some of Domitian's predecessors, namely Vespasian and Titus. So that sort of around the time that most commentators think that Revelation was written, we have an imperial temple in which we start to see sort of the worship of the Roman Empire emperors emerging. So we do have evidence for imperial cults, or the worship of emperors prior to this imperial temple in Ephesus and in other locations. But it's sort of it's particularly important that this temple could be, or this temple was dedicated to Domitian, and there seems to be a thriving center of imperial cult worship in Ephesus around the time that most commentators think that Revelation was written. So this is some of the kinds of information that you're going to find in commentaries about ancient Ephesus. And so then when we move back to the world of the text and the letter itself and reread it, you might be on the lookout for how sort of some of those elements that you learned or that you now know about ancient Ephesus, sort of maybe they show up in the text some way, or maybe they don't. So I'm just going to go ahead and ask you to pause. I'm not going to read this whole thing. Ask you to pause and read through the text again and see if you come up with any places where these historical factors sort of might show up. So for me, I actually struggle to find these things showing up in the letter itself. So if you also read through it and thought, none of these things, I'm not making any connections here, you're in good or bad company, because I don't find a lot of connections. The one thing that I do sort of note or do notice as I reread through this text with this in mind is this bit about, where is it here? See, I should have paused and found exactly what I wanted to say here. There it is. I apologize for that very long and awkward pause. That you have abandoned the love you had at first. So one of the sort of features of Ephesus is that it seems to be one of the early places in Asia Minor where Christianity began to thrive. We, of course, have a letter addressed to Ephesus in the Pauline collection. So perhaps we have this idea that the love you had at first is hearkening back to the early days in which Ephesus was one of sort of maybe an important early Christian center. But besides that little tidbit, there's not much that I find in this particular letter that reflects the world behind the text. That doesn't even, it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily mean it's not there. It's just simply that I don't necessarily make those connections. And I think one of the reasons I might not make those connections is that the seven letters, in my opinion, are meant to be written, read individually, but they're also meant to be read all together. That we shouldn't imagine that the church at Ephesus was skipping over all of the addresses to the other churches. That we sort of see themes that emerge, both about the praise and the condemnation of these various churches, that sort of there's threads that run through all seven letters. And so it's probably important for us to recognize that these seven letters did not, we have no evidence that they circulated separately from their collection in Revelation itself, that they were sort of always embedded in the entirety of Revelation, that there wasn't the letter being sent to Ephesus on its own apart from Revelation. And so this gets at the idea that, if Revelation is probably read as a whole, that the individual letters aren't read separately from one another. It also seems, by the fact that there are seven churches addressed, that John has in mind the entirety of the church in Asia Minor, and maybe even the entirety of the church in the known inhabited world at that point in time. That in a way, the message to the seven churches is a message of wholeness and completion to all of the churches in Asia Minor, or the Asia Minor, or the entire world. And then also you have that repetition over and over and over again in the sort of exhortation to hear that says, let anyone who has an ear listen to what the Spirit is saying to the churches. So John doesn't write, listen to what I'm saying to your particular church. He says, listen what I'm saying to all of these churches, and repeats that 7 times over. So there's a sense in which we should be taking these 7 letters together rather than just taking them as individual letters. And then sort of when we take all the letters together, I think then it's important for us to start looking for those threads that run throughout all 7 different letters. And this is what the process of marking the text for the different features is going to help call your attention to. That as you do that, you should be on the lookout for what is praised consistently in these letters, what is condemned consistently in these letters, and what are the warnings against consistently in these letters. And you might even, and one of the authors of the of one of the 2 optional English exegesis books sort of takes all of these features and puts them into a table. So if your mind thinks, if you're sort of a type A person where you like to have everything sort of lined up, you could make a table that has these 7 different features with the 7 different letters, and sort of put in each feature with each letter. And that'll would really sort of facilitate your comparison of the different letters, and would help you see what is praised, what is condemned, and what is warned against. And then the move from there is to see how those link up with the message of Revelation as a whole. And what you'll probably find is things like what is praised is faith and endurance, which are themes throughout Revelation, and what is condemned is sort of a lukewarmness, a lack of faith, a temptation to turn to something else, to turn away from the Christian message, which again is going to be something that runs throughout the entirety of Revelation. So as you go about this process of marking the text and looking for comparison and contrast, I encourage you not to think only about the specific letter, but also to think a little bit more broadly and think about how these themes open up to other aspects of Revelation as a whole.